Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. The opposition parties have been laying out their shadow cabinets, and I figured we would talk a little bit about what that means. Generally, a shadow cabinet is the opposition critics who are assigned to be the critics of the actual cabinet. The way we do it in Canada, though, is slightly different from other Westminster democracies, in the UK in particular, and I figured we would delve into some of those differences. Generally, the shadow cabinet is supposed to refer only to the official opposition. However, third parties have also generally adopted the term, possibly out of a sense of self-importance, but there we go. One of the things that we don't necessarily do as well in Canada is mirror the actual cabinet in full regard. So you don't have necessarily an opposite for each minister. Sometimes they attempt to do that, but generally certain parties will like to create portfolios of their own or have areas of concern of their own that they want to assign a person to individually, and so therefore they kind of create a critic portfolio for that. The other thing is that we don't tend to refer to them as shadow ministers in cabinet because they don't operate in the same way that a shadow minister does in the UK. Generally, the accepted Canadian term is critic, although Andrew Scheer, when he became Conservative leader, started calling them shadow ministers, but not actually changing their duties or their functions to mirror a British equivalent. Therefore, in my own personal parlance, I still refer to them as critics because there is a difference there, and I think that deserves to be kind of explored as well. So one of the differences between how a shadow critic operates in the UK and how they operate in Canada is that it's a full-time role in the UK, and it's one that's essentially designed to build the capacity for that person to assume the role of minister if they should form government after an election. It's harder to do that in Canada because of the way in which our cabinets are constructed, which has a lot to do with regional lines and other diversity representation issues. So it's hard for an opposition to, create a shadow minister if we were using that model, and then have them carry through. And so after an election, they would be almost certain to go into cabinet in that role. In Canada, because we need to worry about federal principles in terms of regional representation when it comes to cabinet, as well as other diversity requirements, means that it's harder for an opposition party or an opposition leader to assign someone to that role with the eye that they would be permanent post-election, because we don't know what their federal complement is going to look like in terms of what kind of representation they have from different regions. We've just been through this whole notion in Canada right now that the governing party did not get seats from every province, and therefore their federal cabinet is not as regionally representative as it should be. And therefore that kind of creates problems with creating that position with an eye to semi-permanence with shadow ministers. Other differences are that shadow ministers in the UK, it's a full-time job. They don't go to committees. They don't, do any of the other associated activities that critics do in Canada. And they also have a much more formalized relationship with the departments, as in they will visit departments on a regular basis. They will get briefings from department officials. So they are much more in the loop than a Canadian critic is. One of the notable functions of Canadian critics is that they will be the lead person for that opposition party on a parliamentary committee. That is kind of a blending of roles. Part of it, I think, waters down the independence of the committee because you've got the critic or shadow minister sitting on the committee, so it's kind of enforcing a party line on whatever that subject matter is. And the other thing is that it kind of divides that critic's time in ways that they're not able to, fully take on a quasi-cabinet position. So it's not. So this is why I hesitate to refer to them as shadow ministers in Canada, because it's just not quite the same construction. One of the other considerations in Canada when it comes to how critics are assigned portfolios is the fact that the current construction of cabinet is somewhat chimeric in nature. You have a lot of ministers who are straddling departments, taking part of their function from one and part of it from another, and it's difficult to assign a critic to that portfolio when you are also intending for that critic to be on the committee as well. So that critic would basically only be able to do part of the job when it comes to what they're shadowing that minister on. So it's, in order to have kind of opposite numbers, I don't know that it's necessarily working in that way in Canada right now. So that's another reason why I don't want to call them shadow ministers. And we're also seeing the NDP, for example, are breaking out some of their critic roles in specific regional components around, for example, economic development agencies, where there is one minister who covers them all, whereas they are having critics for each regional area. So that's creating a different dynamic as well that isn't letting you necessarily mirror the opposites. The other problem the NDP has, of course, is that they have fewer members in their caucus than there is in the actual cabinet. So a lot of them are doing double duty, on top of this breaking them out regionally. So it's creating an odd dynamic for them as third party in their critic roles. The official opposition, the Conservatives, don't necessarily have that issue. But again, I haven't seen, they haven't come out with their full list yet. We're expecting that shortly. But I'm not expecting them to come out with the same kind of mirror construction of the cabinet, partially for the chimeric reasons and partially because some of those cabinet posts, such as the Minister for Middle Class Prosperity, which should just be an Associate Minister of Finance, but we need, titles. So for them, I don't think they're going to have an actual opposite for that number, but they may come up with their own particular branding associated with how their party line is going. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.